etc. Okay. Clinton's campaign to scuttle and
I feel a little. There we are. That's better.
So we're all set.
Hope you don't mind if I read.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this forum discussion, which is the first of the new semester. Our subject tonight, live from the battlefield, the media, and war coverage. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. It all seemed to come to a head, this subject of the media and press coverage, during the Gulf War in early 1991. It's hard to realize that it was 3 years ago now. Coverage was based on pools. They were pools organized by the Pentagon and reluctantly accepted by the press. Reporters were restricted in many ways in how they covered the war, yielding to what might be called patriotic journalism. The polls showed that the American people supported the war overwhelmingly, and the American press seemed to want to demonstrate that they too supported the war overwhelmingly, or so it seemed from a lot of the coverage. Question at the time, was Vietnam finally a thing of the past? CNN came into its own, introducing the world to the first night early bombardment of Baghdad. And after the war, we learned that some of what we had been told, some of what had been strongly suggested by the government to be true, was not true. And we still have a great deal to learn about the Gulf War. Our panelists have special experience and knowledge. To my right, Peter Arnett, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his Vietnam reporting, was in Baghdad throughout the war for CNN, one of the few reporters who were. His new and wonderfully reviewed book, got a copy of it right here for you all to see. Peter, would you like to sign some of these? It's called Live from the Battlefield, from Vietnam to Baghdad, 35 Years in the World's War Zones. John MacArthur is the publisher of Harper's Magazine and author of a very controversial critique of press coverage of the Gulf War. It was called Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. Rowena Webster, a mid-career student here at the business school, right? At the business school. During the Gulf War, she was news editor and reporter for the Sunday Express in London. And Bernard Traynor, a retired Marine Corps general, once a reporter for the New York Times, and now director of the Kennedy School's National Security Program. The way we're going to do it tonight is the first two speakers to my right, that's a geographic designation only, Peter and Rick, will be speaking for about 5 to 7 minutes each, and then kind of counterpoint, Rowena and General Traynor will be coming in with about 2 or 3 minutes of critique, and then we'll open it up. Peter Arnett first.
Thank you very much, and it must be so cold outside. Look at all you people in the warmth of this room. I've been here before the Gulf War, and there weren't as many of you, so I guess the interest in the press has increased, which is good for all of us. I have indeed written a book. I sat out the Bosnian War in my cellar, only to emerge to find it still going strong, and with U.S. troops still in Mogadishu. And coming out of my cellar and having written a book, my publisher and editor said the reviews are all important, and I got my first review actually early January, just 3 weeks ago, from the American Journalism Review, influential in its own way. And I found that the first line of that review was fine. They said my book was as epic as an Indiana Jones movie, but then it was as brash as a Beavis and Butthead caper. My daughter, my 25-year-old daughter, fortunately educated in Harvard, could tell me all about Beavis and Butthead. And I thought, 35 years reduced to a Beavis and Butthead caper. Of course, I looked at the serious reviews. The New York Times was very wonderful. But what have I got here? Bill Keller, to balance his review, mentioned towards the end that there was just not enough analysis. Where were my reflections on the cosmic issues of our time? But Peter Braestrup, who wrote a review the same day in the Washington Times, and a colleague, said that he enjoyed it specifically because there were no cosmic reflections on the cosmic issues of our times. So I know why my writer friends are more suicidal than reporters. You know, we just get a passing we just get passing comment on our dispatches. I've got a few notes here. I'm on the road in my book tour. I've been interviewed 7 times today, and I've met people who have heard me 4 or 5 times in one day on various radio stations. I'm intimidated by those who are comparing what I say in one station as compared to another and saying you keep contradicting yourself. And so what can I say in these 5 minutes? What I'd like to talk about, I guess, is CNN, because CNN put me in the spotlight. And I guess a few comments on Ted Turner would be appropriate, because Ted was the man who 12 years ago, 13 years ago, introduced CNN to a doubtful communications industry. CNN, my colleagues on the networks tended to call us chicken noodle news, Marvin the exception, I hope. Chicken noodle news, and critics asserted that Ted didn't know anything about the news business, and he said he hired professionals who could do the news. Now, I had mixed feelings about my boss, Ted Turner. He was known, let's face it, as the mouth of the South, famous at that point for getting drunk and disorderly at a press conference marking his capture of the American Cup, the Yachting Cup. I had grown up in my career with the button-down management of the Associated Press, who I shocked not only with my dispatches from the field, but by wearing a brown suit to the office in Rockefeller Plaza one day in the 70s. They never quite forgave me for wearing my brown suit. Ted Turner was, from the beginning, pressed his internationalism ideas onto CNN. Within a couple of years, he had ordered that the term foreign not be used on our air. The foreign desk became the international desk, and he forbade the use again ever of foreign on the air, only as a specific descriptive, such as in foreign minister. And horror of all horrors, he invited television organizations from all over the world, including communist countries, totalitarian nations, others, to contribute each week 3 to 5 minutes of a news package about what they thought was important and their views of world politics or local, regional politics, and send it to CNN, and we'd put it on the air. And we did indeed 30 minutes a day, 2 hours on Sundays, and the traditionalists amongst us cringed because clearly, you know, this was unedited news dispatches from sources that we could not control going on our air. Of course, what happened is that by inviting other viewpoints, we became, in effect, half an hour a day, an op-ed page for other views that was unique in television.
Peter, I'm going to take advantage of our long friendship and ask you to cut to the chase. Put aside the CNN stuff right now and tell us what CNN was doing, what you were doing in Baghdad, and what that tells us about the nature, perhaps, of television as an instrument of coverage today in wars.
But I promised Ted I'd give him a plug. But actually, I was coming to the point, okay? The point, I have a point here. I left the wires long ago, and the point is this, that here is this dreamer, and some said a huckster. The Gulf War comes. It's a major story. We have established ourselves internationally because Ted has made the groundwork, and all countries around the world were receptive to our presence because he had extended a friendly hand. So in Africa, Asia, China, Middle East, Cairo, and he had extended a hand. When the time came with the Gulf War, he not only approved a huge expenditure for the largest television staff in the Gulf War, but he made the most critical decision of that war for broadcasting's future, as far as I'm concerned. In the last hours that preceded the bombing campaign, when all the rest of the American media management ordered their forces, their correspondents out of Vietnam, or encouraged them to leave on grounds of safety, but we really knew it was a lot of pressure from the government, from George Bush, who called CNN at least once, others calling, that when CNN was considering pulling us out of Baghdad, to give up our communications center there, to forego all the permissions we had from the Iraqis, Ted Turner made the decision to let us stay. He sent a message saying, any of you who want to stay should stay. We want to give the people of the world the opportunity to see this live if you are willing to do it, and I don't want my views countermanded by anyone. Now, Ted was in Jane Fonda's home in LA when he made the call. He was distant from the action, but he did make it, and I think that was a critical decision, and in my view, put Ted into the ranks of the great broadcasters, because he went against the flow of sentiment about that war. He wanted the report from the enemy side at a time when this most popular war, the developing popularity of this war was clear, and by making that decision, he angered viewers. We lost some advertisers, but we were able to make, in effect, communications history by being behind the lines, and we intend to be behind in the future. So the lesson I gave you is that bravery in management is also necessary in coverage of the world today. Do I have time for a final comment?
Sure do.
I have a final comment on John's book, which was superb, I thought, in analyzing the war, and he spoke very highly of me. But he did point out his shock and displeasure that he was eyewitness to a meeting that I had with General Schwarzkopf at a gala party in Washington afterwards, in which he saw me shake the hand of the exalted general and comment to him that, you know, you did a hell of a good job in the Gulf, General, and he took exception to that. He felt that Schwarzkopf was a primary factor in controlling information flow, and it's true. But you know, being a field reporter all my life, my experience with Schwarzkopf went beyond the Gulf. In fact, in my book, I have a chapter of him in Vietnam in 1965, and I'd met him over the years, bumped into him, and I had lunch with him or dinner with him at some point before the Gulf crisis. And the rest of the conversation, John, went this way. After telling him he did a great job, I said, however, you know, you were pretty tough on me from the beginning, and you criticized a lot of what I did, and I said I was unhappy because when the Gulf crisis started, I was one of the few people in the press corps who could pronounce your name. And he responded quick as that, yes, but with an Iraqi accent. So how can you dislike a guy like that? I passed the baton to my left, to John.
I'm not going to try to top Peter's joke about, well, I will later. I'm going to save the jokes for later, actually. I'm going to try to play agent provocateur here and get right into the issue of military censorship. And like a good wire service hack, which I once was, I worked for the rival wire service when it was still a serious wire service, the UPI against AP. I'm going to try to advance the story to something that happened fairly recently. And I just wrote some notes here, and it occurred to me that every time I check in on the state of military censorship, it seems to have gotten worse. And this is in no small part because of the government's smashing victory, notwithstanding Peter's personal triumph over the media in the Gulf War, and the media's continuing passivity in the face of an astonishing contempt from the government and from generals like Schwarzkopf. The latest example of this pathetically one-sided relationship came in Somalia last October 3rd, when the army mounted its ill-fated raid on General Adid's South Mogadishu redoubt in a good old-fashioned American kidnapping attempt. Now, as usual, the government kept the whole thing secret from the press, and for what it's worth, and it really isn't worth anything, the Pentagon has a written agreement with the Washington press establishment to bring along a so-called pool of closely guarded reporters to witness major military maneuvers, in exchange for which the reporters are permitted to submit descriptions of the action to military censors who might then relay them to the folks back home, you. Now, that the media bosses have not agreed in principle to what is euphemistically called security review, that's what they call censorship, that's irrelevant. The fact that the media have signed on to this arrangement at all makes them complete hostages of the government. Now, what's interesting about the Somalia raid, of course, is that the censorship failed, thanks not to an American reporter, but to a Somali cameraman working for Reuters and a Canadian reporter named Paul Watson who works for the Toronto Star, neither of whom are eligible for Pulitzer Prizes. I would like to emphasize their nationalities because there were no American reporters in Mogadishu at the time of the raid, and the Pentagon pretends that there were. Now, obviously, the Somali cameraman and Watson realized something was up during the raid and went over to the scene after the fighting had ended and took the now famous video footage and still photographs of the American soldier's naked corpse being dragged through the streets by cheering, ebullient Somalis. Now, of course, we didn't see the pictures of the estimated 300 or 400 Somalis killed by our side, but for the purposes of our discussion here tonight, it's enough to say that one white corpse was sufficient to transform completely the tenor of the political debate on American military intervention in Somalia. Now, the grinning American troops you've seen recently pictured in the papers and on TV leaving Mogadishu are coming home largely because a Somali cameraman and a Canadian reporter beat the Pentagon censors and got the whole country upset. This is not, as the Washington Post misleadingly claims this week, because the mission itself ended in disaster. Because without the pictures, the 18 dead Americans become an abstraction, easily converted for propaganda purposes into flag-draped coffins surrounded by tearful but proud family members. And thanks to the two foreign journalists, George Bush's Christmas photo op to the American people got flesh and blood smeared all over it. Now, what you don't know, and the Pentagon does know, is that the same sort of ugly images could have halted the American operation about a week earlier on September 25th when an American Black Hawk helicopter was shot down over Mogadishu. Now, this did make the papers, they announced it, and so did the fact that the 3 crewmen died in the crash. What didn't make the news, according to a friend of mine, Michael Marin, who's a freelance journalist who's been covering the intervention in Somalia, is that Adid's loyalists fought off the American attempt to retrieve the bodies from the helicopter. Now, here's what happened next in Marin's words, which, of course, none of you know about. Quote,
Where did he write them?
They haven't been published yet. He gave this to me. Quote, the Americans never did get the bodies. Abdi Wili a Somali, told me how men and women and children rushed to the smoldering wreckage of the helicopter and started tearing at the bodies, grabbing chunks of flesh and ripping bones from corpses, fighting amongst themselves for the bigger bones, which made more impressive trophies. I, meaning my friend Marin, ran his story, the Somali story, by a high-ranking U.S. official who said, quote, "There wasn't much left. We only recovered one part of one soldier that was identifiable. We also know that there was cannibalism. The bastards ate some flesh. Then the head of one of the soldiers was on display in Bukhara market. They were charging admission and people were paying to see it," unquote. But as Marin correctly writes, there were no pictures, no change in American policy. So of course politicians want the military to censor the press. Quite logically, they fear the consequences of accurate and timely reporting because it might make them look bad or incompetent or violent, which might interfere with their political ambitions. The military men follow orders. They follow orders from the politicians, but they're also politicians and bureaucrats, and they have to worry about things like damage to recruiting, the chances of losing a promotion, next year's Pentagon appropriation, the possibility of someone lower in the pecking order getting credit for a successful mission, or the entire raison d'etre of the military, which is right now under review. As Malcolm Brown, Mr. Peter's Associated Press colleague from Vietnam days, put it so succinctly, real war stinks of rotting corpses. So the job of the censor is to keep the stink out of your newspaper and off your television screen. The censors claim it's to protect the troops from unscrupulous reporters who are just itching to let the enemy know about attacks before they happen. But this is nonsense, of course. On the contrary, some of the best war reporting exposes the incompetence and stupidity of the sort of officers who get their subordinates killed. When they're doing their job, reporters act as unofficial ombudsmen on behalf of the grunts, as well as the civilians back home in whose name the grunts are supposedly fighting. And anyway, I have been unable to find a single example in American history of a reporter getting a soldier killed by either intentionally or unintentionally violating military security. Now, why didn't we hear a hue and cry from our wonderfully free press after this October 3rd seminar on why military censorship is a bad thing and why honest reporting is a good thing? It would have been logical. Now, that's a complicated question, and I hope we will talk more about it in the discussion tonight. But to be brief, the owners of the media either agree with the censorship, are indifferent to it, or are simply afraid to protest it. And since, as A.J. Liebling put it, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one, you poor citizens clinging to the quaint principle of informed consent don't stand much of a chance. And if you don't believe that the media owners are in either passive or active collusion with the censors, you've got to read my book, which is now in paperback. But for now, just consider Dan Rather's wonderful summation of the sad state of American journalism as reported in my book. He put it this way: suck-up coverage is in, quote unquote. And if you don't believe Rather, consider these 4 items. Pete Williams, who lied so skillfully for the Pentagon during the Gulf War, is now a highly paid reporter for NBC News. Roger Rosenblatt, who in my opinion wrote the single most offensive piece of suck-up journalism produced during the Gulf War, is now the editor-in-chief of the Columbia Journalism Review. General Schwarzkopf is a paid consultant to CBS News and has co-hosted a documentary with Dan Rather on, of all things, Vietnam. And the last time I checked, and I didn't read it in the newspaper, believe me, Free Kuwait has more journalists imprisoned per capita than any other country in the world. And then as an after-dinner treat, please read Peter's book and take careful note of the Associated Press management's total indifference to losing one of the best reporters America has been privileged to naturalize to CNN. It's actually my favorite part of the book because it shows Peter to be the sort of troublemaker I admire most in journalism. Now, if the media owners and corporate managers want suck-up journalism. They hire editors and reporters who will suck up to the government. If they want reporters who want to get the story, they hire Arnett, or they try to develop new Arnetts. If you want to blame someone for the non-coverage we got in Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, and now Somalia, blame the owners. Blame Catherine Graham of the Washington Post, Lawrence Tisch of CBS, people you never heard of, Charles Brumback of the Chicago Tribune, Lou Bacardi of the AP, Peter Kahn of Dow Jones, and the new owners of the Boston Globe, the Sulzbergers, for not standing up for the First Amendment. The generals and the politicians are just doing what comes naturally. That's it.
Rick, I wish you'd speak up. Rowena Webster.
Yeah, well, I wasn't in Somalia, and neither was Rick. But I was in Saudi Arabia, and I think while I was there, Rick was probably in clad cuckoo land, because the kind of journalism that he talks about certainly wasn't the type of journalism that I was in Saudi to do. That wasn't the job that I was trying to do. And I really wonder whether he understands what the situation is when you're in a country like that. I mean, there seems to be a certain amount of surprise about military censorship and an astonishment that a news organization might sign a piece of paper that allows their reporters to get into a country to do a reporting job. And I get the impression that Rick would be happier if news organizations stalled and stalled and negotiated and debated until they had a piece of paper with prettier words on it, words that spoke of more freedom and so forth. But when it comes down to it, I don't think that what is on those pieces of paper, those agreements about pools and so forth, is really what's driving the coverage of a war. Because once you're on the ground in an environment like Saudi, although you might be in a pool environment, there are opportunities for reporters to break away from that. And there are opportunities to go after stories in the way that you'd go after stories anywhere. Now, my feeling is that a lot of reporters did a good job in Saudi Arabia and do a fantastic job in covering wars all over the world, in Yugoslavia, and in the past, that war reporting has been of an extremely high standard. But there have been rumbles from people like Rick about what happened in Saudi, about what went wrong. And I want to briefly throw out a few suggestions as to why that was a particularly difficult arena to operate in. In the first place, this was a war that was basically fought in the air. And in terms of journalistic coverage, that puts you in an extremely difficult position. You can't fly missions. Somebody might occasionally get to do it, but it's very difficult to take a reporter on a mission. And even if you're flying it, unless you're in Peter's position and you're actually feeling the results of that mission, it's very hard to tell the effects of it, because you're in the air and the effects are down on the ground. Secondly, even though there was some movement on the ground, you're in a desert environment. It's a much more difficult environment to report in, because you can plow into the desert and it's extremely hard to get your bearings. Where do you go? Where do you find people? And that made it extremely difficult for reporters to actually know where to go for the source of their story. Then you've got to think about the time span. With a war like the Gulf War, it's so different to Vietnam because it was so quick. The build-up was long. There were a lot of expectations. There were stories drawn out of that. Then you had the air war for a few weeks, but then what actually happened on the ground was over in days. And in terms of reporters building the contacts, the sort of contacts that could get you a really good insight into what's happening during a battle, there wasn't the time. It was over so quickly. And just finally, you've got to think about the manpower. Who are you actually putting on the story when you're covering a war? And certainly the impression I got from being in Saudi was that an awful lot of the American journalists who were out in the Gulf were actually defense correspondents. And whereas a lot of the Europeans were foreign firemen or women. And if you send a defense correspondent to cover a war, this is going to be somebody whose bread and butter is making good relations, having good relations with the military. Now, they may understand a lot more about the technology, about the hardware, but they may find it much more difficult to ask the searching questions, to ask the questions that may be too obvious for them to ask, but that a general reporter will ask, because it's almost like the emperor's new clothes. They don't mind asking the very basic questions that may cut away all the assumptions that people are working on. But if you send defense correspondents, it's their bread and butter to be there, and they don't want to break down their relations with the military. They don't want to be too critical, because after the war is over, they're going back to their jobs, back to their positions, and they still want to have the good relations that they may have built up over many years. So I think you have to take all these factors into account in terms of covering a war. But I really cannot see that just sticking at the point of looking at whether you have agreements with the military about what you can cover, about having a bit of paper in your hand to wave around, that's not going to get you anywhere. Because at the end of the day, covering a war is like covering any other story in journalism. It's about probing, it's about asking the difficult questions, it's about going the extra mile to get to places, to get to people, and it's about building contacts so that you've got people to go to probe and dig some more.
And yet in a war this fast, it was so difficult to build up those contacts.
Yes, although you could be in there earlier. I mean, there was the build-up over time in which you could lay groundwork. But if you left it till the actual war began, then you'd be left standing.
General Traynor,
Well,
your comments, please.
I feel rather overwhelmed to have to respond in 2 or 3 minutes to what I've heard, but I'll do the best of I can. But first, I have had a career in the military as a Marine, as an infantry officer, serving both the Korean, Vietnam Wars, and a couple of other minor excursions. And then when I retired from the Marine Corps, I became the military correspondent for the New York Times and covered the wars throughout the Third World. So in a sense, I have a foot in both camps. But I kind of sense that I have to be the defender of the institution this evening, and I'm willing to take that on.
Defend the truth, General.
Defend the truth, yes. And I'll get to that point momentarily.
Not necessarily the same thing, right?
Frankly, in what we've heard so far, the most interesting item of substance, and one that I would like to return to, was one that Peter brought up, about what Ted Turner did and the significance of that. But let me put that aside for what I consider to be the less substantial things, the polemic on the part of Rick MacArthur with his diatribe on censorship. We have not had censorship since World War II. We did not have censorship in the Korean War, although I must say that there were correspondents who went to Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander, and asked for censorship so that they knew where the fence was and what they could do and what they couldn't do. And Douglas MacArthur rejected it as being abhorrent for whatever reasons, I don't know. There was no censorship in the Vietnamese War. And although there were a group of journalists that went to Westmoreland and the American command and asked for censorship for the same reasons that they did in the Korean War. So I don't know where this censorship is unless it's an implied censorship, Rick. Then you talked about the censorship on the Ranger raid in Somalia, as though there was some sort of conspiracy there on the part of the American forces, which, by the way, were under UN command, not under American command. But there was no censorship there either. And as you yourself pointed out, Rick, there weren't any American reporters there. Because as the result of some reporters being killed, 3 reporters being killed, a couple of weeks previously, the news organizations pulled all the reporters out. Now, I sense from Rick's position that he is an angry young man, but I don't know who he is angry at, the military cum government or the institutional media. His book kind of flays both of them, but I suspect he comes down and he charges the media, the representatives of the media, the hierarchy of the media, of violating a sacred trust under the First Amendment, wherein that they should be able to get in and probe at everything. And I'd just like to point out that the First Amendment has nothing to do with the reporter's right to go to war and report what's happening. As near as I can remember it, and it's written down here because I was afraid I might forget it, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. It does not make the media a public watchdog, and it does not grant the media access to government activities. Having said that, I will also say that it is the tradition in this country that the Freedom of the Press Amendment also extends to the right of the press for access to government activities to report on behalf of the people. And I think it's been well summed up by Justice Black, who wrote some years ago, the press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. Well, I think that is perfectly legitimate. But to the issue of the public's right to know, which is what this is all about, the question is not the public's right to know. The question is, how much should they know, and more importantly, when should they know it? And this is a negotiable issue. This is a negotiable issue, which I'm afraid my colleague over there has difficulty adjusting to. There are natural tensions between the military and the media. And this is good. This is good. But when the tensions become too strained, as I think they are right now, that is not good for the Republic. I think the First Amendment extends the right of the public's right to know and the press to be this kind of fourth estate watchdog. But it is not a universal and all-encompassing right. Now, Rick also talks about the military incompetence and stupidity. That was the term that he used about some of the activities of the military in Somalia and Bosnia. And Rowena brought up another point about defense correspondents currying up to the military because it was in their interest.
Suck up, I think.
Suck up, yeah. Well, no, that was Rick's term.
No, it's Dan Rather's term.
Yeah, Rowena never used that. Now, I find both of these somewhat interesting because the knife slices both ways. Military incompetence and stupidity, and the idea that Rowena advances that any standard journalist going out to cover a war is better than somebody that knows something about military operations. Well, I find that absolutely extraordinary on both counts. Now, I think the most damaging thing to the press during the Gulf War was the American public sitting in front of CNN television and watching a press conference and hearing the asinine and stupid questions coming from the members of the press, many of whom had no idea why they were out there. They were the garden editor of the Milwaukee Times when they got a set of orders to go out to the Gulf, and they didn't know the difference between a hand grenade and a jar of marmalade. And if some of you may recall, as I do most clearly, one twit standing up and asking the briefer in Riyadh whether General Schwarzkopf had filed an environmental impact statement for his campaign against Iraq. Do any of you remember that? It was absolutely astounding. From my own personal experience, I can tell you about the expertise of the general journalist who was out to cover a war. During the Battle for the Cities in November of 1989, I was down in El Salvador covering the operation for the New York Times. And at that time, the insurgents had captured in Salvador City itself an ambassador and was holding him in the Sheraton Hotel, which was surrounded now by government forces. And they were trying to rescue the ambassador and get at the guerrillas. And there were quite a few journalists around there, and the shooting was going back and forth. And one Salvadoran soldier picked up an anti-tank weapon, a bazooka, and fired it into the hotel. Well, in the confines of the streets there with the buildings, it made one hell of a racket. And a journalist from a wire service, which will remain unnamed, turned around and said, "What was that they were firing?" And I facetiously said, "A 155, meaning a 155 artillery piece, which is one of the largest ones that's in the inventory in either the east or the west, with a shell about that large, which would have taken down the hotel if it had hit it." And I thought he understood I was being facetious. But sure enough, when the wire copy came out the next day, there was this report that the government forces were firing 155 millimeter ammunition at the Sheraton Hotel in downtown El Salvador. Well, what I'm saying is that both my colleagues here on the dais have kind of overstressed and oversimplified this very complex and difficult business of reporting war. And I really won't give it any more attention because I don't think it's substantive. But let me get back to the point that Peter made, and I know I only have 2 or 3 minutes and I'm coming up on the last 30 seconds. Peter?
On whose watch?
Peter, you talked about what I would describe as the internationalization of the news as the result of the initiatives of the CNN. And that, in fact, is something that we do have to take into account and discuss, because whether Rick likes it or not, the fact is that most reporting on the part of American journalists throughout our history, to include Vietnam and to include the Gulf and even Somalia, has been from a nationalistic standpoint and almost from a patriotic standpoint. But if you have an institution such as CNN, and there will be others like it, which represents not a national standpoint, but for an international standpoint, this is adding a new dimension to the business of media-military relations. And I'd like you to kind of give your concept of what that implies, if Marvin will allow me to do that.
Listen, who's going to stop you? General, when I was in the Army, I rose to the rank of PFC. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's private first class. This is a general. I take my orders right. So I will go directly to Peter and ask him to pick up the theme about the internationalization of news as featured by, as personified in a sense, wrong verb, by CNN.
Prior to doing that, I would like to respond to the General's comments about an incompetent media, and I assure you, General, that I could give you story for story on incompetent military officers. And my book has several of them. And for every, I should say, innocent journalist out there, there are others who are competent. And if we persist in our incompetence in our business, we're replaced, because we are competitive. And you may ridicule us, but we are tougher on our colleagues than even the military, and we ridicule them. I won't go further. There's just one other point I'll bring up on your comments, that you said that in a sense, the public interest in times of national crisis information, it's a negotiable. It is the information we give to the public is negotiable. Well, I don't know who does the negotiating in times of war, say the Gulf War or the Vietnam War. Who's negotiating? I mean, I just don't see, do we negotiate with the State Department, the Defense Department? Do I meet with the information officer for Westmoreland in Vietnam? I don't think it's negotiable. I mean, there has to be a principle established. And I'll only to end this comment with, as I say in my book, during the Vietnam War, when the AP staff, myself, and others in the staff were under incredible pressure from the Johnson administration that Wes Gallagher, the noble, experienced president of the AP, and I use that advisedly, noble, because he wouldn't think so, but I think he was. He did make a speech in 1967 at a time of great stress in which he said that as far as the AP was concerned, that news organization put public interest ahead of national interest. I think that was a groundbreaking speech, and that was the time when the Vietnam War was very controversial. Picking up on your point about the internationalism of news, I think news has been international long before CNN. I know we have a more direct input, but the Associated Press catered not only to 1,500 newspapers in the United States when I was with it in the 60s, but to 3,000 news outlets around the world, which occasioned a retort from General Butch Williamson, who was the commander of the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vietnam, when he called me in early in the war and remonstrated with me for suggesting that these guys weren't really winning every battle, and that we weren't classifying the Viet Cong as cowards because they fought at night and they kept running away when American tanks approached. And I said, well, and he said, why don't you get on the team, which was a constant theme during the Vietnam War. And I explained to them that the Associated Press was really an international organization, and that while I was willing to report the truth, we didn't really have a team, because included amongst our subscribers were the news institutions in Thailand and in Europe, and even TASS, the communist news agency. With that, he rose up in full fury, ordered me out of the room, and then announced to all and sundry for the rest of his tour that I was a communist because I worked for TASS, the Soviet news agency. Well, CNN then has, using technology, has carried it to a more intimate degree, because we do indeed have our televised signals instantly reaching the rest of the world. And television is a much sexier medium, let's face it. It's one thing for a bureaucrat in Moscow in old Moscow to go through the AP wire and translate it laboriously into Russian and hand it to his superiors. Much easier to have the CNN channel on and see a dramatic event somewhere, or a press conference of the president, and have a translator working with that, which is happening in I believe every foreign ministry that we know of in the world today has a CNN monitor, and many of those foreign ministries have staff who actually sit beside the CNN tube and actually write memos to their superiors based on what they see. And what this has meant is that the U.S. State Department is aware of that, so it's not unusual that they will make a statement at a press briefing aimed at, particularly in crisis times, aimed at conveying information directly and dramatically to the scene of a crisis, whether it's Mogadishu. Mogadishu, by the way, which is a phenomenon of these technological times, when all the television stations were long ago wiped out in civil war and local conflict. The UN set up a UHF operation in which they're able to beam CNN around the city so they can see nothing else, but they can see CNN in Mogadishu and all these little homes. There's a lot of speculation about, to what degree does the impact have on diplomacy, but certainly Saddam Hussein, who invited me and the CNN crew to stay in Baghdad, believed they would have an impact. Each day the Iraqis would be looking at what I was saying, listening to what I was saying, and of course they were trying to emphasize the negative, the civilian casualties. And when the criticism of my reporting developed to the point where Marlon Fitzwater said, in effect, I was a liar, and Senator Simpson criticized me, my stocks went up considerably with the Iraqis, because they figured, I must be on their side because I was so antagonistic, so much of an antagonist of the U.S. government. I used that feeling of that view of, you might say, comradeship on their part to demand and receive an expanded area of coverage, because I insisted that my credibility was at stake. So by having input, by having this international news operation, I could go into other cases, but certainly it is available there is a consciousness in the world that they want to talk through their problems. I was recently in Afghanistan, and all the tribal leaders, even the most fundamentalist anti-American among them, his name was Gulbuddin Hikmatya, invited us to his compound, actually ceased his shelling of the Capitol for a day to allow us to visit and give an interview for CNN. I don't think he likes the news product from there, but he wanted to appear, and he wanted to talk, and he wanted to get his words heard. So I think we're just getting into the early stages of the impact of these international communications on international politics. With that, thank you.
Okay, it's either Rick or Rowena, and I'll choose Rowena. If you would like to respond to anything that's been said about your comments, because pretty soon we're going to go to the audience.
Yes, I mean, I think I'll come back to Mick. Because, I mean, I just feel that you're shooting yourself in the foot, because if the defense correspondents from the US were so good in the Gulf, then where was the questioning? Where was the doubting about how magnificent the Patriots were? Where was the skepticism? I mean, I didn't see that. In my conversations with defense correspondents when I was out there, I can remember one flicking through this book to show me his favorite weapon, as though we were going to go to a fireworks show. And while he was reading up on his favorite weapons, I can tell you that I was off getting to know people. I was on a pool visit one time to the air base at Dhahran, and got chatting to some of the British Tornado pilots and their crew, and discovered that they were living in a compound, and thought, well, maybe this is somewhere that I can get to people away from the minders and so forth. So I let it be known to them that because of the restrictive laws in Saudi, I wasn't allowed to swim at my hotel. So immediately I get an invitation to go and swim at the compound whenever I want. And the result is that I could get to know these people away from the military minders, and it got me contacts and it got me stories. Now, I'm not saying I was the only person doing that, but I certainly didn't get the impression that the defense correspondents were doing that. And to me, that is the way to get a good story and to get to the truth in that environment. Sure, I didn't know as much about missiles and so forth as you do, but I could flick through the same book as this US defense correspondent was doing and learn enough. And if I didn't know enough from doing that, I could ask questions of other people and find out. And by asking those questions, be asking the sort of questions that people who aren't experts want to know the answers to, which can make for a much better report when you're writing it than if you're writing from an expert position. So if there were all these wonderful defense correspondents out there, what were they doing?
Well, let me get this straight, though. What you're really saying is that defense correspondents do not have integrity because their futures are beholden to the institution, the military institution that they're serving. That's really what's coming through?
What I'm saying is that there seemed to be a problem. There seemed to be questions being asked about the quality of reporting in the Gulf, or certainly the quality of American reporting. I'm saying that there seemed to be an awful lot of defense correspondence amongst those American reporters. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I'm wondering whether it's because of their close relationships to the military, their inability to, or lack of desire to ask questions because of what Rick calls the suck-up factor, whether that is why the quality of coverage wasn't as good as it might have been.
Your integrity was not in any way tarnished by accepting the favors of the opportunity to swim in a swimming pool.
No.
You were objective, but they were somehow not objective. I find a little trouble.
Maybe possibly a more relevant way of addressing this would be, there was at the same time, following your line of reasoning, a lot of people who were not specialists, who were not defense reporters. Why couldn't they, if they were better than the defense correspondents, pick up some of the inconsistencies and dig more deeply, as you were suggesting they were capable of doing, than the defense correspondents who do this professionally?
I'm just drawing the contrast between the European coverage, which was generally considered to be more probing, and the American coverage, which was generally considered to not probe enough. And I'm really asking,
No, but
is it because there were
so many of
more
them
more specialists on the American side who therefore didn't ask as many questions?
I think one of the criticisms of the American press coverage was that there were not enough expert reporters on the field to ask proper questions, and therefore you had Saturday Night Live being capable of ridiculing the quality of the questions being asked by the American press of General Schwarzkopf and a few of the other people. Rick MacArthur, I wanted to ask you, you said it at one point, just a sec, you said at one point, no pictures, therefore no change in American policy, making the point about Somalia and linking it as well to the Gulf. Is the corollary of that that if you have pictures, there will necessarily be a change in American policy?
No. There might be. There's a chance of it. I mean, in a democratic society, and
because Bosnia, there are many, many pictures.
I go to great lengths in my book to point out, in my Vietnam chapter, that all of you who are old enough to remember 1965, you could pick up a copy of Life magazine and see photographs by Peter's friend Horst Foss of the most horrible carnage, week in and week out, taking place in Vietnam. And it didn't stop or slow the escalation at all. It just went straight on up until Tet in '68. So it's not a foregone conclusion that, that one ugly picture is going to turn everybody's stomach and turn everybody around. It's a different country in 1965, but a lot of the information you needed to be horrified and to change your mind of Vietnam was staring you right in the face in Life magazine every week. I'd just like to respond to what was said about the professionalization of journalism. As a former police reporter, I hate all talk of professionalizing journalism, and I hate reporters who go around pretending to be professionals. I will take a police reporter like John Kiffner of the New York Times. He always describes himself as a police reporter or a glorified police reporter any day over a pro who claims to know more about M1 tanks or whatever, because they still have the instinct to go for the jugular and get the story. Now, it's be useful to use 3 examples here of stories we didn't get that could easily have been gotten by good, solid police reporting, either in Saudi Arabia or Washington before and during the Gulf War. Number 1, the huge exaggeration of Saddam Hussein's troop strength in Kuwait. Satellite photographs were available to the press. Everybody was afraid to use them. Number 2, the smart bombs, dumb bomb ratio. If you watch TV day after day, you got the impression, the strong impression, that there was nothing but smart bombs, when it turned out to be something like 90% conventional gravity bombs dropped by B-52s in a terror bombing campaign, both in southern Iraq and on the front lines where the Saddam Hussein's cannon fodder was. The third major story that I think was overlooked, well, this one would have been a little harder to get, was when Schwarzkopf got up on television and said, look, see, we're blowing up mobile Scud launchers. And by the end of the war, according to Army statistics, we'd blown up more Iraqi mobile Scud launchers than there were mobile Scud launchers estimated at the beginning of the war. There were 50 at the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, we'd blown up 80. After the war, an amateur reporter like me, a guy who's got good instincts, Mark Crispin Miller, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, he did some reporting, and he found out that we didn't destroy a single mobile Scud launcher, and that the pictures that Schwarzkopf was showing on television with his pointer were trucks. They were just trucks. And he was told by intelligence people, by analysts, those are trucks, Norm. They're not mobile Scud launchers. But he knew it would sound good because everybody was upset about the Scuds. It was pure public relations, brilliantly executed by General Schwarzkopf, but a lie. It was a fundamental lie. Now, those are 3 stories that I believe could have been broken. The 4th, of course, is my story, the baby incubator scam. I don't know if anybody wants to get into that, but anybody could have broken that story in Saudi Arabia before. It was, all the work was done.
No, let's talk about that for a second, but I just want to say that there are 2 microphones down here, and those of you who would like to ask a question of any member of the panel, please come forward to the microphones. Ask brief questions, identify yourself, and that will be fine. Now, Rick, you want to tell your story briefly? Go ahead. On the incubators.
Well, this comprises the propaganda part of the war. And this is what I get really mad about. I'm angrier about this than the censorship, actually. As you'll all recall, it was reported that Iraqi soldiers had pulled first 15, and by December, 312 Kuwaiti babies from incubators. This was amplified by Hill and Knowlton's wonderful public relations operation, which was hired by the Kuwaiti government under a fraudulent arrangement. They pretended it was a citizens group, but it was all paid for by the Kuwaiti government. And it was promoted to death by the White House because they realized that to sell the American people on the Gulf War, they had to convince them that it was a war for human rights or in defense of human rights. Now, there wasn't a single baby pulled from any incubator in any Kuwaiti hospital at any time during the Gulf War. And even the Kuwaitis have admitted it because they hired, after I broke my story in the New York Times about the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, Naira, who was the one who started the fib back in September or October of 1990 at a Congressional Human Rights Caucus hearing. To do damage control, they hired Kroll Associates, a very expensive private eye firm, and they went out and looked for witnesses to the baby incubator atrocity, and they found out that Naira had never volunteered in any hospitals, and she made up some cock and bull story about having dropped in at a particular hospital for about 15 seconds, where she saw, she says, a baby on the floor at the end of a corridor, but then she was hustled out by friends, by concerned friends. The whole thing is nonsense. But the thing was sitting there on a silver, it had enormous propaganda impact. They repeated the scam at the UN 2 months later at the UN Security Council hearing, where they had witnesses, all Kuwaitis, alleged refugees from Kuwait, all testifying under assumed names, all of them lying through their teeth. And they've all admitted it to me, that they lied through their teeth. One guy said he was a surgeon and he'd seen babies pulled from incubators. He turned out to be a dentist. I could go on, but it was a terrible thing.
We've got a lot of questions, and I would ask, please, for the panelists to be brief in their response and the questions equally brief, please.
I wondered what, if anything, protects a journalist on a battlefield like Bosnia or Baghdad or Vietnam. Do they have, what rights, if any, do they have? And like, I presume the Red Cross has some kind of immunity or protection. And if they don't have any rights, aren't they essentially subject to the military on the battlefield and possibly even legitimate targets for opponents who think that they are hurting their cause?
Okay.
I would like to quickly answer that. I have a book here put out by the AP, Images of Conflict, the work of 3 AP photographers who were killed in Mogadishu late last year. They're all young men in their early 30s, brilliant photographers, but they were in Mogadishu, went out on invited by General Adid's people, or some people, to go to a demonstration and were murdered in the streets. Just as was pointed out earlier, on last weekend, a television crew in Mostar in Bosnia were killed. The total is over 60 dead in Bosnia.
So you're saying they have no protection?
It is a dangerous business. They have no protection. What it is that the point I'm trying to make is that unbelievably, you still have reporters and photographers who are willing to go to these areas and who are willing to get the story back to a basically indifferent world, and with no protections other than the belief that what they're doing is worthwhile. This is in the great tradition. If war correspondent, crisis correspondent. There's a whole new generation of people willing to do that, and I think it's remarkable that these people, despite this, there is a story about one of them here, and it basically concludes by, when the AP took a poll of its young reporters and photographers after the deaths of these men, the general feeling was that they would have done exactly the same things in terms of covering that demonstration.
My point is, though, that they have an incentive to tilt the...
I can't allow you to do that, please. Next question over here. Go ahead.
Yes. This is for Mr. MacArthur.
And your
Mr.
name,
Arnett.
please?
My name is Dave Monaro, and I am an MPP1 here, and I speak English as a native speaker as well. I'm glad to see that Mr. MacArthur is here to save the ordinary people from incompetent military officers. However, I reject his self-righteous claims to honest reporting for the following reasons. As you know, and you've pitched your book several times, that books sell, books make money as well as good headlines. And I was in the Gulf War, and it troubles me that reporters would show my head on a stake on TV for economic reasons to catch the big story instead of the self-righteous moral reasons that you brought up. Can you comment on that?
Well, I'm sorry it bothers you. I think it's something the American people have to see. If one of our boys is over there fighting supposedly in our interests, we're paying for him to be over there. Supposedly, our Congress, well, the Congress never gets consulted anymore, but our elected officials are supposed to be doing it in our name. We certainly have a right to know if the Somalis are cutting people's heads off and carrying them on pikes.
Clarify that?
Yeah.
The only thing
It's not a privacy issue.
No,
as far
it's
as
not
I'm
a privacy
concerned.
issue. What I'm trying to bring out is that I think reporters grab the big story. For example, I saw a skier who was killed the other day on TV, and I'm sure many people saw this. Over and over again, that was broadcast, and I think that was broadcast not for any moral reasons, but for purely economic reasons. If we have the big story, we'll draw the most viewers, and we'll get the money.
I have two answers for you. First, I have nothing. I think the profit motive's fine, but there's a paradox here. First of all, I want to ask you if you would rather that American soldiers get their heads chopped off and their bodies desecrated or whatever, or get killed in firefights in Mogadishu in under less than optimal circumstances, and have more soldiers follow them into battle because nobody found out how badly screwed up the operation was beforehand. Would you prefer that more people follow them in to South Mogadishu and get into more firefights where more of them get killed? Is that something you'd like to see?
Well, that's a different point altogether.
All right.
No, but there's a question that I'd like to address to you and to all of the people who applauded your comment that journalists do this only for the profit motive.
It's not only.
On the basis of what evidence do you say that? I beg your pardon?
Well,
everyday viewing of television is your evidence that journalists function.
Let me ask you,
was Peter Arnett in Baghdad for a profit motive? No, but I'm asking you that question. And I'm really addressing that to the people who applauded on.
Well, that's very, but I'm sorry, that's very self-righteous to turn away from this.
Don't give
this
words
man
like self-righteous out, please.
But let me give you
pitched this book 7 or 8 times while we were here.
Let me give you a number. The NBC lost $55 million on the Gulf War. Okay, they sent huge numbers of equipment and material and people and paid extortionate rates for the phone lines and the satellite lines. They lost $55 million. Did they do it out of the profit motive? CNN lost money on the Gulf War.
Hang on. We've got to move along. Thanks very much.
They did. They lost money.
Hang on. Go ahead, please. Name and question.
My name is Tim Ray. I'm a fellow at the Center for International Affairs, and my question's for Mr. MacArthur. Sir, I understood you to say that one dead white corpse, in contrast, one supposes to a live white corpse, caused a change in our public perception.
Did I say dead? I think I said one white corpse. I hope I did.
Caused a change in our public perception of what was going on in Mogadishu, and that this then led to a change in American policy. I find this to be sort of a remarkable interpretation of cause and effect, because most of the research that I'm aware of, whether it's Peter Braystrup talking about the Tet Offensive in 1968 or other things since, says that number one, American public opinion is not that volatile, that there's sort of a mythology that it's affected by a photograph or even a series of photographs. And that secondly, in the short term, American foreign policy, major foreign policy decisions are not affected by blips in public opinion. And so I'd like to engage you a little bit more on your story there and say, could you show us a little bit more about cause and effect of how these photographs changed American policy?
Only briefly.
What more can I say? John McCain was all over television. As soon as this thing happened, he's a Vietnam POW, former POW, and he was going crazy, saying we got to get out of there, based on the corpse, and I did say white corpse, not dead white corpse, and on the pictures of Durant, the downed helicopter guy who's going to, I think he's going to win the Medal of Honor, the one who was taken hostage.
And there's a great deal more research done since Braystrup's book on Vietnam, by the way, on what has happened since then, incorporating the effect that CNN has had. And I think that Rick's point goes to the impact that CNN's pictures have had because they're immediate.
No, but it used to happen with newspapers too. Harrison Salisbury's reporting from Hanoi in 1966 had a tremendous impact on public opinion because he proved that Johnson was lying when he said that no civilian targets were being hit by our bombers. It had an enormous
Next
impact.
question, please. Name, question.
Hi, good evening. My name is Oren Gross, and I'm a graduate student at law school. First of all, as an Israeli living in Tel Aviv during the Gulf War, I want to thank CNN for giving me 2 additional minutes to run to the sealed room before we get the siren. My question, and I would appreciate any answer from anyone who wants to answer it, relates not so much to military censorship as much to, I would call it maybe press responsibility. And the example that I would give is that after one of the attacks that we had, after one of the Scud attacks that we had, we saw, if I remember correctly, it was CNN, a map of Tel Aviv, and on it were shown the points where, allegedly at least, the Scud missiles hit. Now, if I heard correctly, Mr. Annette, Saddam Hussein was sitting and watching the same TV show as I was watching, and assuming that he didn't have any other means of knowing where the Scud missiles hit, that was an extremely valuable piece of information for his guys out there, knowing where they are and where the targets that they want to hit are. I understand the public interest in such an information, but as a recipient of Scud missiles, I found some difficulty.
Let me try to answer that question. There was a conference in Israel 2 years ago that addressed that very issue. And what happened at the time, and I found it interesting, was that the Israeli government had a choice. It could crack down on the entire press or try to persuade CNN that what it was doing could lead to damage to Israeli national security and interests. And so they called in the CNN bureau chief. She listened to what it is that the Israeli government said. She got in touch with her leadership in Atlanta, and they decided they wouldn't do it again, which struck me as one very good example of press responsibility when it is responsibly pointed out to the press what the problem was. That is what happened at the time.
I agree with one qualification, and that is, it indeed didn't happen afterwards. And I guess that my qualification would be that in this specific instance, and there are instances like that, and of course you can give opposite examples, I would assume that a prior censorship would have prevented this even one instance, and the one instance by itself could have caused a lot of damage. The fact that it was not repeated is good by itself,
okay.
but
your point is well taken. Thank you very much. Just a second, Rick.
Sorry.
I got to move on.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Good evening. I'm Randy Shriver. I'm a student at the Kennedy School and a Gulf War veteran, and I have a question for Mr. Arnett. Mr. Arnett, you took exception to General Trainor's comments about the information being negotiable, and your question was, who do I negotiate with? Then you came back and said that I believe during Vietnam was the first time the public interest was put before the national interest. I would come back with a similar question. Who is it that determines the public interest? And I would remind you that the media is an unelected body. It's composed of people who have certain competitive problems getting their stories out and all that. Is that what I'm to take from you, that they are in charge of the public interest?
the military is not elected either, but it elects to serve.
And they're under the command of elected civilians.
I would just point out that by
Okay.
1967, the public interest was determined, in effect, by internal debate within the Associated Press, with its many publisher and subscribers around the country, in the editorial columns of American newspapers. There'd been a grand debate for 2 years, and at this point in time, Wes Gallagher, our president, summing it all up, figured, hey, better to have the truth as our reporters see it than to attempt to conceal it or otherwise hush it up. I just want to make one point to the earlier question about reporters being irresponsible and putting out information that affect the lives of GIs and may upset the GIs. Now, half of my book deals with being with GIs in Vietnam. I went out 3 weeks to a month, every month, for 10 years with these GIs. I reported every day on their activities to Hometown America. Within a few months of my reporting in any unit, they had clippings from the hometown paper of stories that I'd done. Some of them dealt with an excruciating detail with the actions I'd been in. There were pictures to go with these actions. At no time in 10 years did any American soldier I was with threaten me, remonstrate with me, and complain that I was overdoing it or endangering them or embarrassing them. In fact, I quote several letters in my book of military men thanking me, praising me in letters, which I still have, for the work that I was doing there. My problems came with the higher command, who were more embarrassed about what I was reporting than the men I was working with. Thank you.
Question, please.
I have a question for Peter
Name?
Arnett, a sort of double question.
Name?
First of all, Greg Gross, and I'm an alumnus of Harvard and a former journalist. I was wondering when the Gulf War started, like many others, I was watching the television, and when Bernard Kalb ran down to the basement.
Bernard Shaw.
Bernard Shaw, sorry. there are two Kalbs.
That's really weird. It's a hard name to forget, I know.
When Bernard Shaw ran down to the basement, why did he really do that? And I was just curious about that. I think millions of people noticed when he came back, he seemed quite nervous. The second question, which is actually
That's a mean
a more serious one, which is directed to you and also to Mr. MacArthur. Given that the press has a legitimate and important political function in the United States, which is to get information and get it out about the government, about military actions and so on, doesn't the military have an interest in hiding information regarding military actions, including information like dead bodies and heads on sticks that will demoralize the public?
I will let Rick MacArthur answer the second part. The first part, it was a bum rap that Bernard Shaw got from the public by many viewers. They didn't quite understand what he was doing. Partly it was him to blame because he's a decent man. He ran down to the bunker at the beginning because our headquarters in Atlanta had asked, what about the rest of the press corps? You guys are okay. What about your colleagues? CBS wants to know. ABC wants to know. NBC wants to know. The New York Times wants to know. How are they? Have they been affected in this initial bombing? Bernard went down through the darkened corridors, went to the bunker, counted heads, talked to people, came up and reported privately over our line when we were off the air in a news break to all these interested parties what he had found, messages to home, the whole thing. It was a sterling service, and he did it while Holloman and I were on the air hogging the limelight. One other point that he had made later in the morning, which has come to haunt him, and unfairly so, is when he mentioned he was under a table. And many took that to assume that he was somehow cowardly. Well, here was a man who was, first of all, in the room looking at all of it. He was under the table simply in case the Iraqis arrived, dragged off Holloman and I, and he would remain to single-handedly cover the rest of the bombing. So I want to clear the record up with Bernard. He is a brave correspondent. He is a Marine, and he's served in his time in war theaters, and I respect him a lot. Rick can, if he wants to, answer the second part of your question.
I've already answered it. I said
that's right.
They have an interest in covering up, sure,
Right.
because it's dangerous to their careers.
Legitimate
But
interest
just
was
hang
the
on,
question.
we got a lot of
Legitimate
questions and
interest.
very little
Yeah.
time. Thank you, thank you. Question over here, please.
Is there legitimate interest?
I don't think it's legitimate. Yeah, no. I mean, there's a bureaucratic interest, there's a political interest, there's a cover your ass interest. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. They're different interests.
please.
My
Does
name
anyone
is,
have a question to either one of the people on my left? No? No. All right, ask a question. Go ahead.
I don't feel offended.
Go ahead.
My name is Sue Bolstrom, and I want to thank Rick for writing that book. I thought that was the most informative piece of information about the Gulf War, and I felt that he represented my interests very well in the Gulf, and if he made a profit off it, that's fine with me.
I broke even.
Yeah.
It was a pretty small advance. The market was big for Schwarzkopf. It was not big for anti-Gulf War books.
And I'd like to ask a question. As far as the infant formula factory that was later, I think it was originally called a chemical, I don't remember if it was chemical.
Originally a baby milk plant, then by Colin Power, basically a chemical and biological testing center of some kind.
Yeah, I recently saw a documentary that showed that that was in fact an infant formula factory. Can Rick or Peter comment further on that?
No, it was what the Iraqi government said it was, a infant formula factory. New Zealand had provided much of the basic product to it. France had built it. And I reported it as such, quoting the Iraqi government and sending back video of that plant. The U.S. military decided to stick to their, well, they did in counteraction to my report, which surprised me enormously, but they came out and stated that it was indeed a military target. They grew incensed. The suggestions were that I was duped by the Iraqi government, and that story has stayed with me up to today. In fact, I know the American scientist who headed the UN missions into Iraq after the war to look into chemical and biological testing center. They went to dozens. The baby milk plant was never on any list that they had to inspect. And the milk plant is back in operation as a milk plant, but General Traynor tells me that the U.S. military intelligence is sticking to its story. But it seems to me that it was what it was originally said to be, a milk plant. Probably a mistakenly identified target and mistakenly hit.
Nick, do you want to say anything?
No, but implicit, I think, perhaps in your question, although I'm not sure, is that the U.S. Air Force deliberately targeted a milk factory. And I don't think there's any truth to that. They deliberately targeted what they thought was a chemical outfit, chemical factory. Because if you take the other argument, then by extension you have to say, well, if terror bombing and taking out milk plants and so forth, why didn't they hit all the other targets of similar capability throughout the area?
Well, I
so
think
it was a mistake, really.
Perhaps freer reporting in the Gulf would have confirmed or disconfirmed that if the press had more better access to more
Well, the press
sources.
did. He was there.
It's
Later,
not fair
later.
to the other people who want to ask questions. Please, please, go ahead.
I'm Dan Goodman. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm also a Gulf War veteran. And I think Mr. MacArthur oversimplifies the intelligence process a little bit by which General Schwarzkopf may have decided to report that Scud missile launchers were destroyed. Given that, and referring back to a previous question about the head on the stake, I think it's simplifications like these maybe that cause some criticism of the press. And when you have a vast, complex military operation, does it really serve the public interest to show sound bites, essentially? And I don't want to, I want to compliment CNN's coverage, especially since I watched it on a nearly 24-hour basis during the war, which was detailed. But there are soundbite type things like the head on the stake, which I think might mislead the public into believing something about an operation that may actually be a trivial component, and whoever wants to answer that.
I don't think a head on a stake is a trivial component. I mean, I think it's a...
Is that really central, though, to the goals of the operation? And
well,
if that sticks out in the public's mind...
It's central to the story of war. That's what war is about. People get killed. People get mutilated. That's war. I mean, there are other aspects of the story. There's the technical story. How did the armor work? How did the flanking maneuver work? What did the generals say to the colonel at a given moment in the battle? That's part of the story, too. That's the story that's told by generals. The story that needs to be told. I recommend that everybody read Wartime by Paul Fussell. It's the best antidote to the nonsense you hear about the sort of sanitized histories you get of World War II. But you know, the story of the grunt, the person who actually gets shot at. The general, Schwarzkopf, didn't get shot at. I mean, you know, it's the guys out in the field who are getting shot at, and that's the story that, of course, the military doesn't want told, because that upsets people.
And I would like to add in that point that the earliest criticism that CNN got after, in the first 17 hours, calling every target in Baghdad, you know, which we could see from the top of the hotel, and getting praise from the Defense Department and other government officials for our acumen and our ability and our vision in being there and reporting all this good news, was the third night when Iraqi television came up with the pictures and interviews with 15 or 16 POWs, including several Americans, in which I reported first by phone and then early or late that night shipped to Amman, Jordan. General Schwarzkopf made his first complaints about CNN, saying we should not be talking about POWs at this point in time. It is not good for the war effort. Now, the main thought I had in reporting the presentation on television was that it would be word to the families of these men, the Italians, British, and Americans, that their loved ones were alive. They had been shot down. This was the first solid information. And secondly, the fact that we sent out the video was a clear indication, or seemed to suggest, the way that these men had been treated, and it seemed to me an absolutely legitimate news story, which CNN backed. I'd like to hear General Trainor's view on whether that was legitimate news at that time in the war.
Well, I believe that newspapermen, journalists, whether they're video journalists, should be reporting the news. This was legitimate news, and I have absolutely no problem with that. The fact that Schwarzkopf, who, by the way, was not born a general, you know, he understood what it was going through the mud, Rick, and he'd taken his shots also. Generals are not born generals. They start out as second lieutenants.
But what happens, General, on the way up? What happens to you guys?
Well, usually... Usually about the time you make colonel, you get a lobotomy. But no, I think that was perfectly legitimate reporting, and the fact that General Schwarzkopf was upset about it for his reasons, I don't think has anything to do with any sort of objective analysis of the responsibilities and the prerogatives of the press. So I have no difficulty with that. I have no difficulty with any of your reporting from Baghdad. If I were to criticize one element, I would criticize that you kept repeating it over and over and over again. The Amariah bunker, the milk plant, but I understand that there wasn't a hell of a lot of news that you could report other than that, and there were certain imperatives for you to do that. But I have no difficulty with journalists reporting what they see, whether or not the military likes it or not, or the government likes it or not. If this is what they see, you should be able to report it. And I have no difficulty with that. And I, of course, go back to Justice Black, and I subscribe to the fact that the Fourth Estate remains a watchdog, a legitimate watchdog, part of the unofficial checks and balances of this country.
Rowena, you wanted to add something?
I mean, I just quickly wanted to ask you, you seem to be saying that you would prefer to have censorship than elements of the truth. And if that is a general sentiment, then I find that extremely worrying, because you'll end up with the press that you deserve, but it won't be the best press.
That's certainly not what I'm saying, and I spent a lot of time during the Gulf War defending the press against my military colleagues. I'm just wondering whether sensationalistic journalism, and I know that's a buzzword which has a lot of connotations, which maybe I don't mean, but whether that actually disserves the public by leading them to conclusions which may be detrimental to the military and legitimate military and political goals of a military operation.
If the truth is sensational, then what's wrong with reporting that? Are you saying that all reporting should be dull and then that's okay?
Well, it depends on what you emphasize. If you emphasize things, and I mean, I think that, sure, a head on a stake should be reported, but I think it might be trivial compared to the goals of the operation. And if you emphasize something that is relatively less important, aren't you, in some sense, hiding the truth of something that's more important?
The goals of the war, I think, were stated endlessly, time and time again, by every general and every president we had at that time. No, seriously, it was stated over and over and over again. One of the odd things about CNN, because it's on the air all the time, is that a single piece that Peter could have done, by the way, could have been repeated time and time again. It doesn't mean It doesn't mean that Peter was doing it time and time again. We have time only for one more question, so why don't you ask?
Tom Durant from the Mass General Hospital for Rick MacArthur. From 1975 to 1979, millions of Cambodians died rather gruesomely. Who's responsible for the lack of reporting of that Holocaust?
Well, that's a very good question, a very good question. And again, I have to blame the owners of the media. I wish we had talked more about that tonight. There is a stupid belief among editors and owners that Americans have no interest in overseas news. And this bias, it runs right up to the point where America intervenes overseas. Then it becomes a story. But, you know, Peter could tell you 1,000 stories, 1,000 more than I can, about things getting knocked off the A-wire by something like the Tonya Harding story. I mean, the world could be blowing up on the other side of the world, but Tonya Harding is the biggest story in the country right now. And I don't think Americans necessarily are voting for that kind of reporting. I think they probably are more interested in the world than we give them credit for. And in spite of CNN, if you watch the trades, you will see, the trade newspapers, you will see that big news organizations are cutting back their foreign bureaus very, very aggressively. And there is less and less of an American presence overseas in terms of reporting. And more of it's being subcontracted to the British. And it's a very, very disturbing trend.
It is.
And so they should have, you know, we should have been covering it.
But look, with all of the good stuff that's been said about CNN tonight, we have to end by pointing out the fact that CNN covered the Bobbitt trial live.
One more question?
We don't, you want to get it, if you can do it real fast, go ahead.
My name's John Delacourt. I'm a student at the law school. And I think it was interesting that Mr. MacArthur has used this as an example of the problems with censorship of the press as Somalia, because it seems to me that people going from the other side could say that the disastrous landing in Somalia with the event with the press on the beach with all the lights and all of that.
Let me cut you off. Quick answer. The Pentagon announced the time of the landing and invited the press to cover it.
Right. And it wasn't
they wanted
disaster.
the publicity.
And it wasn't a disastrous landing.
It wasn't a disaster either.
It was just a landing.
It was just a landing. And it was invited by the Pentagon. Colin Powell called it the best advertisement for the defense budget you could possibly have.
Right. I would suggest that you continue afterward. You can continue the discussion until midnight. But for everybody else, you've been terrific to come. I think it's a great opening forum. Thanks to the panelists.
Thank you, guys. I want you with me all the time. You are the best.
I'm too scared.
You are the best lightning rod. I want you around. You're the best lightning rod I've ever had with me. I tell you, you take the blows, Rick, and you bear them well.
Back me up.
Yeah.